I'm Nicole Allred. I am from a Media Network, and I'm so excited. We are working to bend the arc of the digital revolution towards shared power, prosperity, and possibility. And to really ground us and kind of get us started here and kick us off, I wanted to show us a quick clip that the wonderful team at Impact Lounge is going to show us. So if you're able to get that up, that would be wonderful.
Why science fiction?
Because there are no closed doors, no walls. I mean, the only rule is if you use science, you should use it accurately. You can look at, examine, play with anything, absolutely anything.
What was it about writing for you?
Oh, you got to make your own worlds. You got to write yourself in. Whether you were a part of the greater society or not, you got to write yourself in. So I got to write myself in.
And you get to do it in the limited world, as you say, because there are no walls, there are no limits.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, you treat subjects like race, sexual prejudice.
Sure.
All of that.
Mm-hmm.
You could put that in
I
a
write
context
about people.
that has all.
I write about people and the different ways of being human. And you can't really do that unless you write about a lot of different kinds of people. You know.
Just have an applause for Octavia Butler. I just love her. She gives me goosebumps. I love that clip. And as she reminds us, I think, sci-fi and science fiction isn't just about spaceships and aliens, right? Like, it's a tool for reimagining and thinking about humanity itself. And a way for us to build worlds with people at the center. So just think about Star Trek, right? 1996, during the Civil Rights Movement, it dared to put her, a black woman, as a critical piece of the team, a communications officer on the bridge. That was revolutionary at the time. Or if we go back to Butler, right? She wrote Parable of the Sower in 1993. She didn't just predict climate disaster. She showed us a model for how community and adaptability could be our biggest technologies for surviving disasters. And today, in this ever-changing world with so much that's happening constantly, we need these visionary storytellers more than ever. And with that, I'm really excited to welcome our panelists, and you're in for such a treat because they are wonderful. Kamala Villasaman is a film producer who's transforming Hollywood's approach to storytelling, from leading inclusive content at Lionsgate to now helming her own production company. Lynn Renee Maxey is a writer, a social justice advocate, and a brilliant mind behind some of The Handmaid's Tale's most powerful and haunting episodes. And Sarah Papazoglakis, a tech ethicist currently at Meta, and a speculative fiction scholar who helps teams create tech innovation that really benefits people and society. So with that, let's get started. I want to step back a little bit and think about something a little bit more personal. So think back to the first time that sci-fi wasn't just entertainment for you, that something really clicked or shifted. Maybe it was a book or a film where you really thought about different possibilities for yourself. Lynn, we're going to start with you.
Okay. So I wanted to use the Star Trek example because it was the first time that I had seen women in positions of power. The first time that I had seen something that a woman was doing on screen matter to her and to the larger group, not just to like her boyfriend that she was running alongside or, but on a much more personal and somewhat oddly scary level. One of the first times for me as a writer that I really saw it was when I started writing on The Handmaid's Tale, because I realized that I was writing a main character in June who was close to my age. She was an editor. I was a writer. She was married to a man named Luke. Like, it got very personal very quickly in a way that I realized how important it was for me to take my own experiences and put them on screen in a way that I just hadn't really thought of before, and I've always hung on to that since.
Thanks. Sarah, I'll have you next. You don't have a mic.
Oh.
That would be useful.
I mean, I've got a booming voice, but my experience with science fiction is a little bit different because I never kind of aspired to think about the future in that way, and didn't see myself in the stories. Like, I was always turning the channel for Star Trek or other kinds of things. And it was really two stories kind of going back to the origins of some sci-fi with Frankenstein, where it was a really story about, you know, Frankenstein's monster searching for love and community, that really made me start to rethink the role both of science, of history, of what was happening in those relationships. And then I got exposed to Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower and was just blown away about how to think about, I never plan to survive the apocalypse, so like, I don't have my backpack plan. But she, you know, brought this world together of like seeing people like me, people in my community, but more importantly, people really different from me, coming together and learning about each other in ways that are really awkward, but are persistent and caring, and they're navigating all of these prescient moments from, you know, everybody's been citing the prescience of the fires in LA, but also the prescience of just like what the erosion of our sense of community and inequality, and who has access to certain tools. You know, you've got some people walking the highways and everyone else in helicopters. Mm-hmm. And that really made me want to understand the genre better and start to think about why aren't technologists really thinking about those stories as much as they're thinking about other stories like Ready Player One and Star Trek, when they're thinking of new technologies and both the good they could do to bring communities together, but also the potential harms.
Thanks, Sarah. We'll dig into that more. Kamala, please.
Sure. I probably am kind of similar to Sarah in that I grew up not really being a sci-fi fan. I think I looked at it as a genre for other people. Those were most of the images that I saw. And I remember hearing someone speak about it, and you know, it was a black, I think she was an entertainment exec, and she was just saying, she was like, when I watch sci-fi, the question I always ask is, what happens to all the black people in whatever the year before the year in this is? Because like, you just do not picture us making it to the future, and like, did something happen? Like, what happened to us? But the first time I think I really encountered sci-fi personally was actually through music. So I was working in the marketing team at Bad Boy, and we had Janelle Monáe for her first like few albums. And she walked in with such a fully formed sense of who she was, and one of the things that she was a sci-fi like enthusiast. So she had an entire alter ego for herself in a sci-fi world that she had created. The first albums, if you remember the covers, they're very like sci-fi. There's like a whole sort of story that she has exactly with the Arc Android. And I just thought it was really cool. You know, her and her team, all black and brown, had just created an entire sci-fi world for themselves to live in. And, you know, there was sort of like a blurring of the lines even sometimes between sort of like our world and like the fictional world that they'd created. And I loved that, you know, they did that. And when I had asked her sort of, why did you do that? One of the things that she said was that she was like, we needed to create a space where we felt fully at home and like we belonged. And if it didn't exist, we were gonna create that. And so I just think that that is one of the real promises of sci-fi and just sort of imaginative fiction overall, is to create spaces that don't yet exist and then create in people the desire to make those things true.
You get to write yourself in.
Yes.
Right, we get to write ourselves in. Lynn, I'm going to come back to you. So, you know, thinking about The Handmaid's Tale and science fiction, as you were talking about, Kamala, as well, and other science fiction, and specifically dystopia, right? Like, dystopia is essentially painting a very vivid picture of what happens when one key thing goes wrong or when everything goes wrong. And of course, we saw that a lot in The Handmaid's Tale.
To put it mildly.
Did that very well. Did you ever feel a need or a responsibility to incorporate hope? And what did that balance look like?
Yes. The first answer is yes. I absolutely felt that responsibility to include hope. The thing that, just not even specific to Handmaid's Tale, but for me as a writer, the thing that I say all the time is I am looking for stories where no matter how dark it seems, there's always hope. Because I think that it's really easy, I mean, we've even seen this in just the last several years of everything happening, and it's really hard to watch the news, and it's hard to go through so much of these things. Like, there's so much despair and just sadness out there that if I'm telling some sort of dystopian story, if I don't include hope, what am I sharing? Like, what am I putting out into the world? And what am I wanting people to take away from it? I think that, looking at something like Handmaid's Tale, it would have been very, very easy for us to just be like, it's all bad all the time. Everyone wants everyone else dead. The end. First off, nobody's gonna watch that show, or they're not gonna watch for very long before they're like, I can't anymore. But the thing that we saw so often, and the thing that I've seen even in, with the fires in Los Angeles, I live in Los Angeles. I had a go bag packed in case I had to evacuate for the fires, which, let me tell you, that will put your life in perspective very fast. There's something about that hope and that connection and the community around you that you're not alone. The first episode that I wrote of The Handmaid's Tale is the story of Luke finding a group of fellow refugees and escaping to Canada. And the line, it's literally 2 lines in the book because you never follow Luke's journey in the book. But one of the things that Offred in the book says is, I imagine Luke 3 ways. 1, he died in the forest where I left him. 1, he's, in a Gilead prison somewhere. But there's a third option, and she doesn't think that this happened, but she said, what if he made it across the river? He made it into Canada, and he met someone, and they took care of him. And she says, it pleases me to dress him warmly in my mind. And that just kind of became this North Star for me of what are even in this terrible moment in a really dark dystopian story, what is that person opening the door and saying, come in, let me feed you, let me dress you warmly, that kind of gets you to the next day, that gets you to the next month, and then hopefully you get to do that for other people. I think about that a lot because that's what I hope happens in our world. And if you don't put that in your stories, people might not be able to imagine that it could exist.
It's an example. It's a glimmer of hope. As viewers are watching that, they're thinking, this is the worst of the worst, and someone is still able to extend a hand. Yeah. Someone is still able to look outside of themselves.
Yeah, exactly. I love that.
Sarah, I'm going to bring you in here. You have this really unique position straddling both tech ethics and storytelling. So particularly sort of given the shifts that we're seeing within big tech, especially recently, I don't believe that anything is in its own compartment, right? Everything is connected. And so I'm curious, what has been your vantage point? How has it impacted what you think is missing from storytelling right now, especially from being within these systems?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'm always struck by is that when I bring stories trying to adapt, whether it's product narratives, bringing other communities in to tell a story about a potential product, drawing from science fiction as a way to inspire product teams to build more inclusively around what we call curb cut effects, which I am experiencing right now, about how, ramps and things like that built for a particular population, but they benefit everyone. So how can we find those moments in both stories and in product development that are, yes, maybe our target is a distinctly marginalized group that's currently left out. But building for that person doesn't mean we're only building for them. It actually often leads to better for everyone. And what I see in this connection between stories and tech development, and I do think in our socio-political world around us happening, is that there is a very narrow subset of stories, and fetishized technologies that are appearing in novels and in TV and in film that are anchored upon. It's Ready Player One. It's the replicator, in Star Trek, the holoport machine in Star Trek, and that limited view means that technology is coming from very narrow imaginations, and so it's not about just doing away with all of that necessarily, but how much can we expand that lens to think about it a different way? And I just want to, when we talk about it in reverse, about like, hey, can you be inspired by Octavia Butler? Can you be inspired by other, Indio Corafor's amazing, I love her short story, Mother of Invention as an example. It becomes very difficult. Oh, that's so hard. I don't know how we would do that. But, you know, I remind people that Neil Stephenson was Bezos's first employee of Blue Origin. And then he was hired as chief futurist of Magic Leap VR company. And you know, there is a very direct pipeline between stories and imagination from certain, you know, demographic of science fiction. And I think there is a whole lot of potential that when we start to tell more of the stories in multiple different formats, we've talked a little bit offline about, you know, why hasn't more of Butler's work been adapted into TV, film, and other that can help to shape not just the technology and the thinking, but the audiences and the environment, the socio-political environment around us too.
This feels like the perfect place to bring you in, Kamala. You know, what stories do you feel are missing from this age? I think especially storytellers, production companies, Hollywood in general, it has this humongous platform on which to tell these stories and to influence people, especially going off of Sarah's point. What do you think is missing?
Yeah, I mean, I've been thinking a lot about the question you asked and that we talked about with regards to Octavia Butler's work, right? And I think if you think about sort of her canon, there probably isn't an equivalent author of like that level of prolificness whose work hasn't been massively done and redone in Hollywood. So we have to always be aware that like structural racism, sexism, misogynoir, all of those things show up even in the places where you're like, well, you should just be looking to make a good story that would make you money, and she's written plenty of them, so let's go do that, right? There's always other forces. So when it comes to the stories that are missing, one of the things that we think about and what our company is really focused on, you know, I've just launched Cast. We describe it as stories at the intersection of culture, commerce, and representation. And by that I mean, like, we are looking for commercial mainstream stories because we really want to shut down the narrative that stories that are about underrepresented people are only for those people. But we still want to tell stories that are about underrepresented communities. So when it comes to what's missing, there are very few sci-fi stories that are centered on people of color, that are centered on LGBTQIA people, people with disabilities, even women, like still very few. And it raises the question of like, well, what do you think happens to those people in the year 2525? Why aren't they still there? How can we tell stories about what could be? But I also think when it comes to focusing stories on historically excluded communities, one of the other benefits, I think, is we can create blueprints for what a better world can look like. So I'm excited to see more stories that really demonstrate the potential and the promise that DEI has always meant, as opposed to this narrative now of DEI being a narrative of giving people things they don't deserve, of taking things away from you. It's me against you. I was even in something today where someone was saying even inclusion has been weaponized and turned to be a bad word. When someone says something is inclusive, there's someone in the room saying, so it's not for me. And it's like, one, we need to get back to the definitions of what, because words mean things.
Here's the dictionary.
They just, right? Diverse means something, inclusive means something, equitable means something, and it doesn't mean what that narrative is. But how can we actually show stories in all genres, sci-fi, but also rom-com, drama, comedy, that show people of different backgrounds actually being able to interact with one another in positive ways, but also being able to recognize the cultural differences that they hold and not see them as barriers. I'm not looking for colorblind. I'm looking for color conscious and color inclusive.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I love that. One of the things that someone told me very early on in my career is that the point of inclusive narratives, or seeing representation on screen of all different people, of all different genders and races and religions and national origins and everything, is not just that so we individually see ourselves on screen, but so that other people who aren't like us are used to seeing stories about us, and that it's not just about it. It again opens it up to that
Totally.
like wider version of we all see each other.
It's moving from the charity-focused aspect of like, I'm making this so this little girl and blah, blah, blah can see herself. It's like, I also want the little boy to see that little girl.
Yes.
And if that little girl is of color, even better. If they are not of color, like, it's not just for us, it's for everyone.
So I'll throw something. I'll be a little bit tricky here, though.
Just going off
We
script,
like to be
I
a
feel
little
it.
bit tricky.
Thanks for the
I'm going
warning.
off script. I'm going off script. What would you say, though, to people who would say, or producers or executives who would say, but if I put that black girl in it, it's just for those people, or am I going to make money, right? Like, can you get both? Can you have broad appeal while centering those characters? Is that possible?
Yes. Yeah. Next question. No, I mean, so here's the thing. I think that like Hollywood is suffering from a problem of its own creation, right? We have for a long time, for decades and decades since the inception of the industry, have cemented this idea of white as neutral and everybody else as other. So if you are a white viewer, you are very used to seeing yourself on screen. And if you are a black viewer, you are very used to seeing white people on screen. So to everyone, they are like, well, that is what is universal. Right. Like, but you built that. You can unbuild that. There are lots of examples, obviously, everything from Get Out to Crazy Rich Asians to Black Panther to all the things. But I think that what happens in the industry is that those things are still elevated as exceptions. So when you try to use them as, you know, case studies of why we need to do more, they're like, oh, but I mean, you're not gonna make another Black Panther. So like, you can't use that as a comp, right? I talk about the tyranny of comps in our business, because to get something made, you have to be able to point to 10 other times that thing was made and was mostly successful. But I'm like, but if you haven't made even 10 of our things yet, then I can't point to 10. And if one fails, then like, that's the case study. But if one succeeds, they're like, well, I mean, that's like an exception. So I was like, so let me get this straight. All the wins don't count, and all the losses do count. You're clever. But nevertheless, we persist, and we can tell those stories.
Yes.
And make money.
And make money.
Yes.
And make money.
Because, I mean, we live in a capitalist
Study
society,
after study
right?
after study after study. Every year, I'm like, diversity is the one defendant that just can't get off. Mm-hmm. Every year, try it again. And they're like, these diverse stories are making more money. I'm going to try something new next year.
Must be a one-off, and you're like, oh my God.
You're like, please release us.
Yeah. I mean, as a writer, I've gotten those questions from potentially well-meaning executives who are asking me those questions, or I'll turn in a script. And like, I had an example of a script that I handed in, and one of the lead characters is a gender fluid character. And they had so many questions. Why? Is this important? Does it have to be? Are you sure? I don't know. We might offend people. And it was just this like horrific litany of terrible things that they were saying. And all I did was say, what made you think that? Like, where are the, like, explain to me why you think that. Explain to me kind of what your thought process was. And even even like asking, not to say that I went in and did everything right. I didn't. But once I started asking those questions, people were like, oh, well, that's a really good question. Or like, you know, I had one person one time ask in a script that was predominantly women as main characters, say, where are the men? And I looked at her and I said, they're in someone else's movie.
In all
Everyone
the other movies.
else's movie.
Yes. And the best part of that was she was like, oh, great. And like kind of laughed, but like went on. And it was that sense of like, oh, you did this on purpose. Okay, great. And I was like, okay, great. But that's what it takes sometimes. Like I'm gonna make someone tell me no and explain why before I'm like, well, I don't wanna get in trouble. I just gotta get around the notes. No, I dare you to give me that note, please.
I want to kind of stay with this sort of idea of themes and genres, and I want to bring you in, Sarah. How does this kind of connect into what you're seeing and from your vantage? Because, you know, we've spoken offline a little bit about this, the different genres and how certain tech tropes have led to certain tech tropes and storylines that we see, like Ready Player One, for example. Can you speak a little bit to that and how, what do we need to be updated in this moment? Why do we even need to get away from those tropes?
So it's such a big question, and I'll just throw out a pitch for a collective that several collaborators, Dr. Teresa Hayes-Vermilly, some of you may know Lauren Ruffin, who's a producer in the space, and a few other folks have come together around an initiative or collective called Autonomous Futures, trying to re-signify what autonomous means there, away from autonomous cars, but us as our autonomy in an age of automation. And the project started actually through a fellowship initially several years ago that I funded at Meta, and now it's become, it has nothing to do with Meta anymore and is its own thing, but we basically put together an archive of like 40 different Afrofuturist, indigenous futurist, Latino futurist text, and started, and we read them and watched them, which is so funny in the tech space now. People are like, what machine did you use to read them? I'm like, no. We read and we watched and we analyzed, exactly. But we saw some common patterns that at first we were like, oh my gosh, is this even sci-fi? If you read something like Wild Seed, one of Butler's novels, not to over-anchor on her, but I do love her examples because it is so much about the past and the future. It's so much about ourselves as technologies, like can instinct be technology? Can our imagination be technology for building a different community? At the end of the day, technology is a tool to serve a particular purpose. And I think what is so distinct in some of the genres that we put together of common themes is that they are not fetishizing technology, and they are also really attentive to the past and how much the past is available, accessible, and like supporting future technologies. And I'll make that concrete. If most people are familiar with Black Panther, the kimoyo beads are signifying on concha shells, and they are community connectors. They are only activated when you want them to be activated. There's not a surveillance eye in the back watching you through them. It's always, there's agency there. There's connection to community. There's something about building for the community, and there's something about connecting with ancestors and being able to hide in plain sight as well. That's part of that technology, what Ruha Benjamin in Race After Technology, I think, would call like strategic silence, about how we use tools for us and for our communities to keep us safe, to keep us connected. And a lot of the other stories that dominate what's being built are actually really dystopian stories about power, about surveillance that you cannot escape, that are, things that are, we know we have TSA face rec that is supposedly opt-in and different things like that. And we do live that, and those are important stories to tell about what the end result of that looks like as we continue in the acceleration of that development. But what is missing a lot of time are the counter narratives of the power and agency and autonomy we have to push back against that. And to, whether it's as consumers, whether it's as constituents, whether it's by building our own thing. I am a PhD in literature, not engineering, and I think it's hard for some people to think of me as part of a product team sometimes, but I'm as central to building those systems as a lot of the engineers are as well, and I think we need a lot more people like that in the space. And yeah, does it slow things down sometimes because I don't, code Python or C++? Yeah, sometimes, but it also usually makes for a better outcome once we wrestle through that translational work of what the outcome of a certain product should be, what the story is about who it's serving and what it will look like out there. And so for me, it's those stories about just where we have lost everything as a result of this tech determinism, and the hope that you were talking about. I do love that in The Handmaid's Tale, that you see communities just finding the interstitial spaces to come together in the midst of all of the eyes and the surveillance, and not fetishizing the technology, but remembering they are always tools of power, tools that can empower as well.
I love that, and I want to pick up on some more of these themes. I'm just going to turn to the audience and say we will be opening it up for questions, so get thinking about what wonderful questions you have for our panelists in about 10 minutes. Just going back to one of the themes that you brought up, Sarah, I think this idea of broadening what technology means is really interesting, and also thinking about doing it as a collective. Maybe just pivoting us a little bit, and then maybe you can bake this into what you're about to say. What do you think about the idea of, I think we traditionally consider, tech innovation comes from within tech companies. What do we think about this idea, and this is for anyone that wants to answer, does tech innovation always come from within companies? What about those people that are like, well, I'd love to get involved with this, but I don't have any power to change or shift what's happening with AI. I don't have the power to shift what's happening at Meta. How do we think about that? How do we think about getting outside of tech spaces and the inspiration that can come from outside of spaces?
Yeah, I have so many thoughts if anybody wants to talk later. But Watch Duty, if many of you have been in LA and using that app, that is a nonprofit app put together by people because they saw a need, and that was, I think, the #1 downloaded app over the past month. I think it's an incredible example of, and there is a role of, funders. You can't sustain all of this on a volunteer economy. Or even on it's not scalable, but it's not scalable not for the traditional reasons you hear of the idea's not scalable. It's often not scalable because there isn't an incentive model around the people with the purse strings to do that. And so I think that does take people in business positions, people with funding capacity to really shift that and support that, because that cannot only come out of volunteerism or side hustles that people are doing something as a passion project. But I think there is huge space for people coming together, and also you don't have to be building the technology. Oftentimes I think it's easy to bristle and resist against what we don't want, but how about also, and I think that actually, I just want to be really clear, is super important. So that, and it's a both and answer of and then what does the alternative look like, right? If we don't want face rec, for example, all over TSA running through databases that might miscodify people, especially people whose accuracy rates in these systems are less than for other people. How do we maintain safety in the airline industry and offer alternatives? And I think that comes from imagination. And that's one tool we all have together. I think the current model that we have with technology is crafted by the tech industry, which is literally opt in or out. And I don't think, especially with the advent of AI and the rapid acceleration of it, that we're seeing, that it's becoming an infrastructure for a lot of the things we do. So the idea that you can just opt out and be like, I'm not into this, I'm going off the grid, you have to be a certain level of either privilege or escapism to be able to do that, because most of us have to be able to use that for our employment, to bank, to, if you want to go to see the Warriors play in San Francisco, if you want to buy a water, you got to use AI. So I think, I do think imagination and collective imagination of what we want. The building is actually easier. I mean, you see companies building around physics all the time, finding ways out of physics. But it's the ideas that are really lacking.
Lynn, what do you think about this idea of inspiration coming from outside of tech companies?
I love it. There's a couple different pieces of this, but to build on what you were saying, that idea of you don't have to build the technology and that idea of imagination, I think one of the things that all of us can do is really advocate, even in our neighborhoods, for education that isn't just focused on coding and math and you got to be ready for the future, but don't let them get rid of literature classes. Don't let them get rid of music classes. Don't let them get rid of, and I say them there's some specific them, but there's something about that idea of you can be inspired by a book you read. The idea of you as a literature PhD in these tech spaces, I love that, because you're going to take something, you're going to see things that other people don't see. You're going to have a different way in, and maybe it might be something that helps them fix something. You're going to make it better, not like, oh my gosh, we have to let the English major talk, which I have been in many of those scenarios. And I also think there's something really powerful in, you look at the technology that we have today and imagine how it can be used for good. Like right now there's such a focus on, social media being the thing that divides us and, puts walls up. And that's absolutely true and something that we need to fight against. But there are ways that you can use social media for good to connect with other people. And so specifically looking for those kind of opportunities, like for a personal example, I'm chair of the board of a nonprofit organization based out of Los Angeles called Mary's List, that we provide practical, individualized support for new arrival refugees and their families and communities. And a huge part of how we do that is through social media, by reaching out to people, by connecting with friends of friends of friends. And we constantly have volunteers coming in. We're like, how did you hear about Mary's List? And they're like, let's see. So it was this, and you trace it back 6 people ago, and thank God someone put it up on Facebook. Yeah. Thank God, there's ways that you can use technology and that inspiration. And hey, what if instead of, we can't do anything about it, what if we got on Zoom and all talked about it with people from all over the world? You can use it to hopefully push the world forward in a new and more beautiful way.
I was going to add, because I love the idea of technology, one being reconceived as not just something that's happening in Silicon Valley, but also the idea that it might not also even be just an individual pursuit. I think this is where the storytelling comes in again. We really need to see more characters that are women and people of color and LGBTQIA and disabled and older Americans, all of that, actually working in things that are adjacent to tech. If you ask someone what does a tech exec look like, or what does an engineer look like, or what does a hacker look like, they're all picturing some version of a Mark Zuckerberg, right? That is what we have seen. And there's a lot of structural things behind that, a version of him that walks into a VC firm is probably going to emerge with more money than a version of me that walks in. But where are the VCs getting their ideas about who knows things about tech? And so I think that it's worth thinking about how, from a storytelling perspective, in all genres, again, in an action movie, in a sci-fi movie, in a rom-com, can we actually have, I got a script, for instance, recently, and the female character in it was a nurse, right? And that's fine, but I've seen women that are nurses in popular media so often. And I was did you consider that maybe she was a doctor? Did you consider that maybe she was an engineer? Something that we just haven't seen. Those little things can be so meaningful. And the idea of community-driven, grassroots sort of technology and building together, that it's not just something you go into your room and you're hacking alone for 8 hours and you come out and you're like, I made it, I made the thing for you all, do you want it? Right? What if you're building it with the people that you are actually envisioning it to be for? And so there's so many examples of the long tail of how seeing a certain representation in a certain professional field really can statistically change who signs up for that. Boomerang, huge increase in Black people of a certain age being interested or knowing about advertising. A Different World, huge increase in HBCU enrollment. Grey's Anatomy, huge increase in interest in being a surgeon. We know that media works. We should just use it intentionally.
And it harnesses its power. I think it's broader than sci-fi then even, right? It's thinking about popular culture and the fact that we make pop culture, literally, right? We decide and determine what is popular and what's important. And we have that power, and so we have to live up to that responsibility as well. We are going to turn to you all in the audience. If you have questions, please raise your hand, and there'll be some mics that come around. We want to get through as many questions as possible, so please keep your questions brief.
Hi, this question is for Miss Kamala. Is that how you?
Kamala.
I
had a shot.
Thank you, no problem. I didn't see any disclaimers sometimes on these panels, people in your position, people in my position to submit to you, to introduce themselves. How can I get on your radar, send something that might pique your interest? I know you mentioned something about a script that you recently got. Would you particularly be interested in something that's already completed, something that has distribution, something that's looking for distribution?
How do people reach you?
I can answer that very quickly.
How can Ronell reach you? No.
Hey, Ronell. I can answer that very quickly, which is I am pretty active on LinkedIn, so people DM me all the time. Obviously, I can give all the usual disclaimers about unsolicited submissions and needing to make sure that things are coming through reps, agents, managers, et cetera, but I read things that are submitted to me. So, feel free to reach out on LinkedIn and we can see if we can chat.
Wonderful. Other questions, other hands? Yes.
It's me. Hi. I think this is the opposite question. There's so many, impactful lessons that you're sharing with us today, but I wanted to know what demographic you would hope to reach with what you're saying now, like any one of you. Who you think the most critical demographic is to hear this message? Word.
That's a really good question.
That's a great question.
I'm like, I think it's important for different demographics to hear the message for different reasons. So someone who maybe is older or more privileged or can walk into a room of VCs and walk out with more money, I want them to hear this so they have a different story that they're telling so that they are fighting. I also want, imagine really, really young people. I think about it all the time, younger kids that are watching these stories, what are they seeing? What are they seeing in terms of what their future might look like that's not just sorry, you're not going to make it to 30. What's the hope? And so I think that it is for everybody, but for different reasons. I think would be, for me as a writer specifically, I'd be very interested if you had other answers.
Kamala?
The first thing that came to me is definitely Gen Z and Gen Alpha. So I'm a part of another group that's working on sort of leveraging narrative storytelling to advance gender justice. And one of the demographics that we've really honed in on is we really want to see what we can do to reach young men and young boys. Because talking to women and girls about the toxicity of the patriarchy, we know, we are experiencing it. We're all too clear. But what we're seeing right now with the manosphere and all this other stuff, there is such a narrative out there that women's empowerment is bad for boys and men, right? It means the end of masculinity. It means the end of whatever, a whole bunch of other things. And I have a 7-year-old son, and trying to raise him away from toxic patriarchy and toxic masculinity is very, very difficult. He watches sitcoms, he's obsessed with Full House. And every once in a while, I'll watch an episode with him and I'm like, this is delightful, but there are so many subtle aspects of patriarchy and toxic masculinity, even in this very bubblegum show. And so I think reaching Gen Z and Gen Alpha is really critical to the work that we want to do.
Sarah, and then keep your hands up for, could we get her, get a mic in the back?
I got it.
Yeah, and I just kind of want to go back to something Lynn said about just people in their workplaces pushing and not just saying, oh, I got this critique and so I'm not going to push this thing forward. But having a lot of courage, I think, is I definitely think people in positions of power need to hear this as much as anybody else, but I also think that finding those spaces for courage of pushing back on these moments where it's either too expensive or too costly to bring in a co-design of community members, really fighting until you are told that door is firmly shut, because sometimes that is that's not the only thing that's going to lead toward structural change, but those moments of courage and pushing and building community with colleagues to also push, I'm never in this alone, I think is really important for people to hear of even when you're not in a super powerful position, that bringing that voice into the room, bringing that perspective, finding moments to show how important that is can be really transformative. And if you can start to transform one product team, you can start to slowly transform culture around other places as well. It's not the only thing, but it's one piece.
I feel like we could have a whole separate conversation just on that. Other questions?
I'm over here.
Oh, yes.
Hey,
please.
everything that you're saying is super impactful, not to use the word on the thing behind you. But, we live in the era where the revolution is televised and also on social media and also moving forward. And we've seen, since the advent of media moving forward, that a lot of very important social justice things have moved forward because of the reach. Where do you see storytelling intersecting with civil disobedience and tech in this world that we're moving into with this new regime that we have, and where we can be making our greatest impact as service-driven storytellers, using the media and the tech wisely in a way to mobilize that community that you're talking about?
It's a great question. Who wants to comment on that?
I mean, I guess I don't know if this will be a satisfactory answer, but one thing that I'm super excited about is like filmmakers like Amanda Strong, who's premiering a new short animated film here at Sundance, are portraying stories like she's Bidaba in one of her short films from several years ago, is following an Ojibwe youth who is connected through forces to a 10,000-year-old Sasquatch who communicates to her through this tool, a technology, a rock, that translates between like Ojibwe and English. And kind of wakes her up in the morning is how we open, and then is following and inspiring her and bringing ancestral knowledge into her, or this youth's life, to go and tap maple trees for maple syrup. And the story is one of strong resistance that's a model for how we can draw upon multiple different real, imagined, spiritual forces to push through. The youth encounters like floodlights, kind of telling her to go away when she's trying to mark the trees that she's gonna tap for sapling that her ancestors tapped and things like that. And she perseveres. And I think stories like that help us see something different about using tools for translation to connect with other people, looking at ways of resistance that include multiple spheres in addition to maybe the communities and political communities that we're already a part of, I think are a really important part of imagination and genre. That's a claymation story, and the slow motion of it really forces you to take in those moments in a way that action, anime, other kinds of things are not going to have you do. And I think those kinds of stories are just so important for helping us find those new ways, because we know that every time our tools are appropriated and adopted against sometimes, so we need that constant imagination in different genres and stories.
I would also say there's something to be said for, like, right now we're saying, we need to do these things so that our world is better. We need to do these things. I really think that it's important also as part of storytelling to go back and see what people have done before us in ways that have worked. So like for instance, the climate change space, I was talking to a couple of scientists doing research for a project that I'm working on, and they were saying that in the 80s, I think. Nobody did check me on this. In the 80s, if we wouldn't have outlawed chlorofluorocarbons from hairspray, we would be several degrees warmer than we are right now. And that's something that gets totally missed in the climate change space and in the storytelling. And so seeing ways of like, oh, it's important that we do this and there will be an outcome. Because if we wouldn't have done these things previously, like here's the outcome that you're currently living in that you didn't realize, that you just assumed was like a way of life. I think that's really important to then help people understand that their current resistance, that their current choices are gonna matter in the long run, and that like gets me up out of bed in the morning.
And it ties back to your...
Yeah.
I was about to say, it goes back to the hope. It goes back to the hope piece. Even when we're in these moments that we feel like are unprecedented, and often they are in their own way, there are still things that we can look back to pull on and say, okay, they did this.
Yeah.
What do we do?
Yeah, people that have thought about these same questions before, we don't have to start at the beginning again. We can start where they left off, or perhaps more importantly, continue to bring them into the conversation.
Kamal, did you want to add?
Yeah, I think the only thing that I would add is that I'm really interested in sort of the coalition work that your question sort of hints at, because just down the hall or across the hall or wherever, we have some of the folks from Good Energy that are here doing their Earth Day and their programming. And I feel like there needs to be more spaces where folks that are on the activism side can connect with folks that are on the sort of entertainment and storytelling side, both the writers and also the executives. Because a lot of times, someone might bring in a climate consultant on a certain show, right? But only on that particular show, not on all of their other shows. And mostly from a read the script and tell me are we gonna get canceled or is something wrong, right? Which is not gonna lead to the most sort of creative, fruitful exploration of that thing. I've been thinking about it a lot post-election, voting. I don't know that I've ever seen a character in a television show or a movie vote. And if I have, it was probably in a movie or a show that was about the political process. And so where do the characters in the shows that we watch who live in America live? Where do they vote? Do they have a local representative? Do they have any political beliefs? And those are the types of things that will make studio buyers and other people go, oh my God, politics? But they live somewhere, and you don't even necessarily need to let me know who they are voting for. But if we normalize the act of voting as a part of being a citizen and a human in the world, that might be more effective than knocking on people's doors every 4 years being heard that you voted once, you want to vote again? And I have done that, I do that. We have to do the immediate urgent things when they are immediate and urgent, but also can we build something for the future? And so just little simple things I'm maybe in our movies and television shows that we make, we'll always make sure it's election time. And a character will talk about voting. It's not going to be what the movie's about, but just they'll vote.
Well, and again, to bring us back to Butler, it's about people. People are the protagonists. People are the center of this. It's about this, politics is a piece of our lives. We are human. This is part of the human experience. And not sort of, again, putting it in a box. I think problems come when we put things in a box. It's climate over there, it's politics over here, it's race over here, it's gender over there, it's storytelling over here. These things are all connected. We're living this glorious and fraught existence that has these interconnections. Any other questions? I think we have about maybe one or two left.
Hi.
One or two questions. Hi.
I'm Carmiel. I'm part of the nonprofit that Kamala just mentioned. Good Energy is a climate storytelling consultancy. And so I'm climate all day, every day. And so what I'm thinking about during this panel, of course, is the repercussions of showing tech and scalable tech as a solution to climate on screen. And what we see, along the spectrum of climate stories is anything from dystopia and warning against tech as a solution to, the utopian version where it saves the day, So is there a great example? I love the nature-based tech and imagination kind of tech that you guys have been talking about, but is there an example of scalable tech in media or in the real world that we can help our writers integrate that doesn't, of course, let us off the hook for doing what we need to do now?
Can I jump in?
Absolutely.
So Nanaba Becker has a short film called The Sixth World about a Navajo astronaut leading a diverse mission of scientists. The Navajo Nation is part of it. She's leading that part to colonize Mars with corn. And ancestral corn is seen as contaminating the lab in that she's in trouble, basically. I'm not going to give it all away. Y'all should go watch it. It's part of Future States, yeah. But the example is that the kind of sterile corn that is allowed in the lab, that is supposed to be the perfected corn that they're bringing to colonize Mars and that can, survive from Earth to Mars in different environments and stuff like that, it is killing them on the ship and it's dying on there as well. And I think one of the things that film offers a lot of promise for is the both and answer to exactly the problem you're talking about. Is like, tech is, again, a tool, and it is neither going to save us nor be the singular architect of our destruction, but how can we find the places where our structures of science, the laboratory, the ways that we're bringing tech in, can marry with our climate, the things that we need to survive, like the ancestral corn that still has its tassels and husks and other things that in the lab does not. That it's actually bringing all of those forces together. And I think that a lot of indigenous futurist work, oh my goodness, I'm forgetting his name. There's a pottery artist, Virgil, whose last name I'm so sorry I'm forgetting, but has exhibits in New Mexico right now, using pottery to also imagine different tools for the future and for a more sustainable climate. And I think that there are a lot of examples in a number of different places, but I do think indigenous futurist films are one place where they are really thinking about that both and solution that cuts through the dystopian-utopian divide.
Thank you. We are so almost out of time. I want to keep going. I really do. But I am the moderator, so I get to ask you one more question to close. So I'm going to use that power. So in our final 5 minutes, what is one story about technology that you believe that the folks shaping our digital future should experience? Let you think about it.
This is a very, might be a basic answer, but honestly, Frankenstein. First, because shout out to Mary Shelley, love her. Everyone should read Frankenstein, but I think that there's something about the idea of taking a technology, an idea, without considering the long-term consequences, that just feels like something you should think about. And you have just so many different ways of expressing that without those kind of mental guardrails, again, yay literature classes. I think it's really important, which is why I hand out Frankenstein quite often.
Frankenstein. Thanks, Lynn. Sarah?
Can I cheat and give two? So I think Washington Black by S.E. Adugian is a retelling of Frankenstein and actually a retelling of an enslaved person's narrative, but it re-examines technological developments of the 19th century and puts a different character at the center of that. And I think it's a really powerful story about all sorts of inventions, from like hot air balloons and air travel, all the way to inventions of museums, aquariums, and classificatory systems that undergird technology. So I highly recommend that one. I think somebody's optioning it to turn it into a film. I think it would be an amazing film. And the second one is a really short art project called Sankofa City. That was a good example of a collaborative art project that really envisions what like smart glasses, smart cars, all those kinds of things could be when they actually preserve community, preserve history, integrate past, present, and future, and do so with a community of collaborators and artists to envision that.
They both sound amazing.
They both sound great, and I'd love to ask you about that first book again. Yeah. So as I said, I'm a newbie producer. So the first thing that comes to mind is there actually is a heist movie that we are working on right now that I hope we'll be able to jump through all the hoops that lie between development and actually getting it on screens. But it is centered on a Gen Z group of friends, all pretty much black and brown, mostly female, who are trying to do a little mini heist on the billionaire that owns everything in their city. And what I love about it is that you have a young black, there's one young black female character who's like the hacker, she's the brains of the group, right? There's another one who is they just all have all these different skills that you've seen in typical heist movies, but mostly embodied by white men in their 40s. And having that be embodied by black and brown people in their 20s, I just think is really cool, and we're hoping to make just a super entertaining movie. But I just keep thinking about seeing this young black female hacker is going to be so cool for so many reasons.
Amazing. Don't you just want to watch and read everything that they just mentioned?
I can't wait for
Thank you so much. I hope you can join me in giving a round of applause for our incredible panel. Thank you.